Hello and welcome to Biology Videos at TDA. We're going to be looking at now, going on to chapter 14, hormonal communication. Just before I start, a reminder, the caboodle test is the next thing to do if you haven't done that yet. Thank you for those that have, I've seen them. Just contact me if you can't log in, so don't struggle, just contact me and I'll sort it straight for you. I can send you a link. Okay, so this lesson, what we're looking at, we've looked at nervous communication in a bit of detail. We're now going to do the same idea of hormonal and then a little bit of comparison between the two. In this particular lesson, we'll be looking at endocrine glands. We'll also define what an exocrine gland is and target tissue. We're going to look at cyclic AMP a little bit, and we're going to look at a variety of different glands. In this lesson, we'll introduce most of them, but we'll go into a bit more detail about adrenal glands in this lesson. I just thought I would show you some word origins. There's going to be lots of words come up, so I thought I would try to give you some origins. I'll try and do this throughout. But here's some. So a hormone is from the word hormone, and that's a lot of these words come from Greek and Latin and various other places. So hormone means to excite or get moving, so kind of starting things with hormone. Exo means outside. You kind of see the prefix of this word and things like exile, things like that. You also got exocytosis, endocytosis as well, to move out and within. So the links between the biology topics, it all kind of makes sense. And then endocrinology is the study of this. So endo, you've got within. So crino means to secrete. So you're going to have exocrine glands and endocrine glands. You can kind of see where the words go together. And then ology, or just logy, the study of. So endocrinology is the study of the secretion of glands. So highlighted here are the major endocrine glands of the endocrine system that we're going to look at. So you'll have known most of them a little bit at least. So you'll have heard about the pituitary at GCSE. The ones that you'll have heard of that I haven't done much about is the thyroid gland and the thymus. We're going to look in detail at the adrenal glands. You'll have heard of the pancreas. That will be one that we'll go into quite a bit more detail. Heard about the ovaries, heard about the testes, but you wouldn't have studied them. We look at the ovaries a little bit, not so much the testes in this topic. Before I go to an animation, I thought I'd show quite a common example where you can see the thyroid glands. So if you see the thyroid glands position that they are, or around the Adam's apple, in some people, and it could be due to a heavy menstruation, some people get it worse than others, they can often swell up for a variety of different reasons, the thyroid glands. You can even see them. Okay, we'll go to the animation. Okay, so I'll summarise, and we can click on these animations, we can sort of summarise what each one does. So you can perhaps start to make notes and list these down of what each endocrine gland does. So the pituitary gland you've heard of before is the master gland. There's lots and lots of hormones, so this won't be just this. And this is summarising because you have the anterior and the posterior, so anterior front, posterior back. And we'll look at this in more detail later on. But as a reminder, you've got luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, but there's others you'll know of, things like the ADH, antidiuretic hormone as well, from the pituitary gland. You also got the thyroid gland, which makes thyroxine, which is going to be helping regulating basal metabolic rate, so the rate at which we do reactions. The pancreas, you'll have known of before. We will study the pancreas in detail over a lesson, but you should remember from your GCSE some of the important hormones that we secrete from there, glucagon and insulin. And this is a new term that you haven't heard of before. We'll be looking at these islets of Langerhans cells, so these cells around here, and again we will look at these in more detail in another lesson. So this is another one we're looking at. You've got the adrenal glands, which are located, you can see they're just sitting above the kidneys on the top of them, so we'll look at these in a bit more detail later. They make adrenaline and noradrenaline and various other ones as well. And then this is trying to represent both the testes and the ovaries in this image. So you've got the ovaries, and we know the two main hormones from there are estrogen and progesterone. And then finally the testes make testosterone, gonadotropin, various other hormones as well. Okay, so let's see what you picked up from there. So if you list down these different hormones, see if you can write them in the correct place. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, so you should have matched them up. Easy peasy. So exocrine glands now, not endo, exocrine glands. We're not going to look at too much in this lesson, but I wanted to define it for you. Exocrine glands are glands that secrete a chemical, not necessarily a hormone, into a duct. Endocrine, what we looked at previously, is directly into the bloodstream. Okay, so exocrine glands are into ducts, so they're like little tubes that go to other places. and endocrine, what we've been looking at for this lesson, is directly into the bloodstream. So you need to know that. Make a note of that, please. So some examples of exocrine, and you've probably heard of bile coming from the liver, storing in the gallbladder, and then going down through the bile duct and going into the intestines. So that's another example of exocrine. You've got the mammary glands from breast tissue. They're going to secrete milk. You've got gastric, so for gastric juices, and sebaceous glands inside the skin. So there's lots of different examples. You just the key point to take from this is you know the difference between exocrine and endocrine. Whilst I've got the chance, we can have a little look at some of the islet of Langerhans cells, and if we use the micrograph, you can see kind of these cells which are highlighted around the black there, and you find them within, and you can see there's a little duct there. Well, I can show you the labels as well. So you can see the little duct which comes from here, which is going to secrete it, and then you've got the exocrine glands and the islet of Langerhans cells which are in there. We've also got in the pancreas the islet of Langerhans. You can see in more detail. You've got the alpha and the beta cells within those islet of Langerhans, and those secrete insulin and glucagon. So we'll look now at the adrenal glands, and we'll look at the two main parts of the adrenal glands, which is the cortex and the medulla, and they work quite independently. So where you find them just above the kidney. They're about 3 by 5 centimetres, so they're quite small, and then they have these main two sections. You should have heard of the phrase cortex and medulla, such as when we looked at the brain. Cortex generally means the outside tissue, and the medulla in the middle tissue. So the key point number one to understand is they do different functions. So the cortex works in conjunction with the pituitary, which will then control things like blood pressure, basal metabolic rate, some sex hormones and puberty, whereas the medulla is involved in the fight or flight response and communicates with the hypothalamus. So the medulla will release adrenaline and noradrenaline, and they will be in response for that survival response. So although they're in the same organ, they have quite different functions, and the way that they act will be slightly differently. So if we look at, first of all, the cortex, we can see some examples of the corticosteroid hormones. So you've got hydrocortisone, and that helps the body use up fats, proteins and carbohydrates, helps with metabolism. Corticosterone, so this hormone is suppressing the inflammation, and you've got cortisol as well, which is involved in the cortex, and it helps. One of the big things that the cortex does, it helps with the stress response. You've got aldosterone as well, which is helping. You may have heard of it already when we looked at the kidneys last year, but that's going to help regulate the level of sodium, so therefore salt, which is excreted in the urine, which helps that water balance, blood volume and pressure. Now, if we look at the medulla, and a lot of these, just kind of keep an idea on, is a lot of these hormones work in conjunction with other ones. So we've got some of the corticosteroid hormones which work with cortisol, which is another hormone involved in stress and the immune response. But as well as that, the adrenaline will also be. So you've got epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is the American way of saying adrenaline, noradrenaline. We'll use the term adrenaline and noradrenaline, but you will occasionally see this version come up. It's the same thing essentially. So adrenaline is that instant response. So the medulla will get signals from the hypothalamus that says there's stress response, fight or flight going on, and that will come down via the sympathetic nervous system. As we know, we've got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic speeds things up, parasympathetic slows things down, looks at digestion, that kind of thing. So when it gets this response from the brain, it's then going to cause the relaxation of smooth muscles within the arteries. So there'll be receptors on here. They're from alpha and beta receptors that are on the inside of arteries. So when we have this adrenaline being released by the medulla directly into the bloodstream, that's going to then cause the receptors on the muscles that constrict our arteries to our muscles, in particular our skeletal muscles that help us run, escape, fight, those kind of things. They're going to then relax. You've also got noradrenaline that's more involved in things like cardiac output, and this one can have vasoconstrictive effects. So this one will be constricting areas that is less needed to have that blood volume at that time, so things like your digestion, your gut, and that will increase blood pressure, because we hear of blood pressure, high blood pressure being bad. in health, but that is for a person who has chronic, so over a long time, high blood pressure. That can lead to cardiac and heart disease. So temporarily, we want this high blood pressure. If we're doing exercise, we want it to go really high. Okay, so we're now going to look at how these hormones actually act and how they work. So we'll start off by looking at adrenaline. So there's a lot of similarities to what you've studied before already in terms of things like the lock and key model, the idea as receptors bind. So if we take adrenaline and we refer to this as our first messenger, that's our first response. Now you see this phrase first messenger less common. You tend to see the phrase secondary messenger, and we'll come to that in a second. So this first messenger, this hormone adrenaline, will be released from the adrenal medulla, and they're going to then bind to the cell surface membrane receptors. That's then going to cause this enzyme, this inactive adenyl cyclase, that's then going to cause a secondary change to occur. This is going to cause ATP to convert to cyclic AMP, so adenosine monophosphate instead of triphosphate, which is a really common secondary messenger. You're going to see this all the time. You're going to see the phrase cyclic AMP come up all the time, and it's essentially a second messenger that acts just inside the first receptor that's then going to cause a change in an enzyme. It's going to cause an enzyme to start doing something more or less that's then going to lead to response within inside the cell, and that could be a variety of different things. Okay, so then you've got this primary first messenger, and then you've got a secondary messenger which ends up in cyclic AMP, and that's because adrenaline, the hormone, can't pass through the membrane. We'll look at types of hormones in a second. So now we're going to look at estrogen. So I've got a couple of images here to look at in regards to estrogen and a different type of hormone. So estrogen, before I go on to that, I'll just show you this. So I've looked for the best way to summarise different types of hormones. So there's two main types, and you can kind of pause the video and have a read through. You can use this page, you can maybe copy it, take a picture of it, whatever you like, as a reference point if you're ever unsure about what type of hormone. And you are expected to know different types of hormones. You are expected to know, for instance, that aldosterone and estrogen are both lipid-soluble steroid hormones, and you need to know that insulin and glucagon are not, and they can't pass through. They're not lipid-soluble. So you can use this as reference if you need to. So if I go back to estrogen now, the way that estrogen works, rather than binding to a receptor on the cell surface membrane, one of the ways that it works is estrogen will pass directly through the cell membrane because it's lipid soluble, pass into the nucleolus, it will pass straight through there, again it's lipid soluble, and rather than causing a secondary messenger to cause a change, it will often act almost directly on the DNA. Now you'll look at transcription, so we know transcription from year 12. We'll look at transcription factors in chapter 19, but to summarise that for now, a transcription factor will speed up or slow down the rate of transcription, and therefore the rate of making proteins, and it can turn on and turn off the making of particular proteins. So as estrogen comes in through the cell, in through the nucleus, it will then either block or it will cause a change in gene expression, so this making of proteins. So it's now, by binding to it, a different polypeptide, a new protein will then be made. And you can kind of see this from, it's another version of the same thing here. You've got your lipid-soluble hormones that come in, they'll diffuse into the cell, they'll cause some kind of complex, and that will then cause transcription to occur, and this makes a new protein. That's going to change the activity of the cell itself. Now you will look at some of these examples in chapter 19 more directly anyway. So the main kind of activity I want you to do now, I thought I would shorten it a little bit. I want you to evaluate, so remember what the keyword evaluate does, is you discuss both sides and then give an overall conclusion. Which type of control is best? Now there is no right or wrong answer, there's no mark scheme here. What I want you to do is to really think about it. Is it hormonal or normal? So I want to read this, so when you submit your notes, can you write it out so I can read that and then I can give you some feedback on it. So evaluate which type of control is best. Now you can do that by going onto the textbook, and if you log on online, there's a digital part of the textbook. If you didn't have it already, it's really important that you get this, and there's a little table here, and you can use this along with information you've learnt from this lesson and from nervous control, and you can make a discussion around that, and that's what I want you to do as part of this assessment. So your task, I'll just put it back up for you, is evaluate which type of control is best, hormonal or nervous. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Thank you very much, guys. Submit the work as usual.